Hello everyone, this is Toyo from Houkago Card Time, and today class is in session for the first ever episode of Teach Me Miss Toyo, a series where we aim to break down some tips and tricks about card games to teach you how to become a better player. Today's Teach Me Miss Toyo is going to be about playing to your outs. So, playing to your outs, what does this mean? Some of you might have already heard this term, but if you don't, well, it's less of a general tip and more like a mindset that you need to get into. So a lot of players often make the mistake of, well, my opponent is probably going to beat me, so I'm just gonna play safely and play conservatively, and then maybe hopefully I can win somehow. And that's totally wrong. You need to start thinking about how to turn around the situation you're in and pull out with a victory on top. This is important because not losing does not equal winning in card games. Those two are two very different things. Not losing is pretty much just delaying the inevitable, while winning is what gets you to the victory tables. So yeah, that's basically what we're going to be talking about today. Playing to your outs. That's a pretty interesting term. Where does it come from? So playing to your out means that if your opponent is putting you in a tough situation, you need to figure a way out of that situation, right? And that's where the term comes from. Playing to your out is basically just, getting out of a tough situation your opponent is putting you in, turning it around, and finding a way to win off of that. Now, there are basically 3 steps towards achieving this, and the first step is to, what do you call it? You try to look at the game state as a puzzle. You look at every card on the board, you look at every card in your opponent's hand, you look at every card in your hand, and you start to think about, okay, what do I need to top deck? What do I need my opponent to top deck? What does my hand beat? Can this hand beat my opponent's hand? You start thinking about all that stuff, and I know it seems like a lot, but with enough experience and enough gameplay, you start to figure these things out just on the fly. And then once you figure that out, you get into step 2, where after analyzing all the possible outcomes, after analyzing all the possible, permutations of the board state, you start thinking, okay, now I know what my opponent's hand is, roughly. I know what my opponent's top deck is. I know what their win con is. Now, what's my win con? How do I win? You basically have to start thinking about not just how do I survive another turn, you need to start thinking about how do I push through my opponent, how do I get through what they have, how do I break down their defenses and come out on top. This is a pretty important thing to learn, and you probably won't learn it just from watching this video. It's something you have to hone, something that you train for, something that you play a lot of games of to develop your sense of, your winning image essentially. And then the third step is, well, just to put it into effect. Now, one thing to remember is even after playing to your outs, you still may come up short, and that's just the way card games are. Card things like triggers exist, RNG exists, risks. Even if you take all the risks, sometimes it still doesn't pay off and you lose anyway, and that's just a fact of card games that you need to learn to accept. Now, let's talk about some pretty concrete examples. So, in this instance, we are going to be swinging with our Vanguard. So, we have no cards in hand. Our opponent has enough cards in hand, and they decided to pass our Vanguard. So, your first check reveals a critical trigger. Now, what should you do? Well, you have 2 options. You can put everything to your Vanguard, or you can put everything to your rearguard. What happens if you put everything to your Vanguard? Well, your opponent is putting a 2 to pass, so if your next trigger check is another trigger, then you win. But if the next check doesn't reveal a trigger, then you lose. If you put all effects to your rearguard, then your opponent still has a few cards in hand. You don't know if that's enough for your opponent to guard or not, but you do know if they manage to guard this, they're swinging with a pretty big Vanguard that will kill you next turn. So you need to win this turn no matter what. So you can't take any risk of your opponent surviving. So you decide to put all effects on your rearguard. And your second check reveals another trigger. This time the trigger doesn't matter, you just give it to your rear guard and it swings, and oh, they have just enough to guard, and now you can't win, and your opponent is going to kill you. So let's rewind a bit. Now, if you check the first trigger, you give all effects to your Vanguard, and then your second trigger reveals another trigger, and you put all effects to your Vanguard and you win because you just broke the 2 to pass. Now, you don't know that your second check is going to be another trigger, so how do you determine what the best play is in that situation? Well, let's consider all your possible options. Option 1, you check 2 triggers and you win. Option 2, you check one trigger and you lose. Option 3, you check one trigger, put it all on rearguard and you lose. Option 4, you check two triggers, put it all on your rearguard and you win. Option 5, however, you check two triggers, put it all on your rearguard and you still lose. So what's the right thing to do here? It's maybe pretty difficult, but I think in this instance, because you're going to lose if your opponent is able to live no matter what, it's best to put all effects on Vanguard and just risk it. Because you don't know if your opponent can guard or not. By putting all effects on your Vanguard, you are playing to your one and only out, which is your opponent losing on this turn immediately. You are leaving things up to chance without leaving it up to your opponent's hand, and I think that is the safest option in Cardfight Vanguard, for instance. Of course, this is only a very specific example, but I hope it gives you a pretty good idea of what playing to your outs mean. It basically just means taking risks when it's necessary. I'd like you guys to take a look at this graph. So this graph is basically a chart where it shows that how much a player is willing to take risks. Now, a new player starting out the game, they take risks all the time because they don't know any better. Now, a seasoned player, someone who's, you've played a few games with your friends, you've gotten into the Vanguard, you start to know everything about the game and how it works, trigger placement, etc. You consider yourself a pretty good player. Now, you start to take a lot less risks. You don't want to get blown out by your opponent. You start to be careful. You start to be cautious. Ooh, maybe my opponent could have this and it will be bad for me. So you start playing conservatively. And you start taking a lot less risks. Now, this is where a lot of players are. But over to the right, you have the pro players. You have the really good players. These are the players who know when to take risks. Not because they don't know any better, but because they know that the risks outweigh, because they know the rewards outweigh the risks. So all of these players know how to play to their outs, and it's important for you to learn how to play to your outs so you can learn how to become a better player. And maybe you can join all these pros over to the right side and not be down here on the middle with the rest of the plebs. So yeah, that'll be all for today's lesson. I hope you guys found it useful, and see you in the outro. Thanks for watching the video. If you like what you saw, make sure to like and comment down below. Also, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new uploads. Thank you all for watching. This is Toyo from Houkago Card Time. See you next time. Bye bye.